This is J'Ba Fofi, a giant spider cryptid that is said to dwell deep within the Congolese forest.
Deep within the uncharted jungles of Central Africa, locals warn outsiders of a predator they insist is very real. They call it the J'Ba, a spider so massive its silk can span entire paths.
J'Ba Fofi, or the giant or great spider. Their vivid descriptions depicted these spiders as predominantly brown, with a distinctive purple marking on their abdomen.
Those who cross its territory are never found whole, only bleached remains hanging high above the forest floor. For generations, explorers and soldiers repeated the same chilling account.
But the people here say this jungle is home to something else. Monster spiders.
Their stories were written off as superstition until a scientist decided to prove them wrong. Encounters the world tried to ignore. The first warnings about the giant J'Ba Fofi spider came from people who vanished, barely survived, and people who saw something so large and unnatural that authorities refused to believe them. The earliest recorded incident took place in 1938 near the Ituri forest, when a missionary team reported what they described as a ground-shaking web stretched across a narrow jungle trail. The missionaries were familiar with large insects and dangerous animals, but nothing prepared them for threads that looked like thick white ropes and vibrated with a force that could be felt several feet away. That night, 3 members of the group disappeared. They did not wander off, and they did not get lost. Their belongings were still at camp, and the ground showed clear drag marks leading away from the tents. The only survivor was a man named Robert Hale. He could barely speak and only repeated one detail. He said he saw a shadow that moved like many arms lowering itself from the trees. Colonial officers dismissed his account and marked it as a fever hallucination caused by malaria. Yet the officers still collected pieces of a strange silk from the site. The samples were quietly archived and never investigated further. Another disturbing encounter occurred in the early 1940s. A Congolese soldier serving with the Belgian military staggered into his outpost in a state of shock. His uniform was covered in thick silk fibers. Medical staff reported that he could not move his legs for several hours due to what they described as instant paralysis. They tested his blood and found traces of venom, but the toxin did not match any known spider. Belgian forces then sealed off the surrounding area for half a year. The reason for the closure was never explained to the public. Local hunters have their own accounts. Members of the Baka community reported finding monkeys that had dropped dead without any visible wounds. When they looked closer, the monkeys were wrapped in thin silk layers that were almost invisible until touched. The bodies were partially drained as if something had fed on them. In another case, a young child wandered away from a village and did not return. The search party found torn clothing beside a large depression in the mud. The impression looked like a footprint, but it was wider than any human track and deeper than any mark left by a gorilla. Scientists in the early 20th century ignored these reports. Western researchers claimed the stories were exaggerations or folklore. This attitude remained even when early explorers documented webs enough to block entire footpaths. One zoologist in the 1920s wrote in his notes that he often felt heavy vibrations above him, as if something large moved from branch to branch. He assumed it was a monkey, but the pattern of movement did not match any known primate. His notes were archived but never investigated. If the earliest witnesses described the same monster again and again, the real question becomes what the forest tribes knew that outsiders refused to understand. The legend, the tribes refused to speak fully. For centuries, the Baka and Mbuti communities have lived, knowing that something massive moves through the rainforest. They do not treat the J'Ba Fofi as a myth or a lesson for children. They treat it as a real creature with habits, rhythms, and responses that must be respected. When outsiders first hear the name, they assume it is the only term the tribes use. Elders quickly clarify that J'Ba Fofi is a gentler version meant for visitors. The true name is spoken only within controlled gatherings during daylight because saying it after dark is believed to summon the spider. This belief rests on the idea that the creature can sense sound vibrations across vast distances. The tribes follow quiet rules that appear simple on the surface, but are grounded in survival. Certain walking paths are completely avoided, not out of superstition, but because those routes are known for sudden and total silence. Hunters explain that when birds, insects, and frogs all fall quiet at once, a large predator is nearby. Silence in the rainforest is never normal, so those areas are viewed as part of the spider's domain. Villagers do not question this. They simply build their lives around the threat. Another custom involves placing offerings beneath certain trees. These gifts usually include small portions of meat or fruit. The tribes insist this is not worship. It is a gesture of respect, meant to make the spider overlook human presence. Elders say that generations ago, these offerings reduced unexplained vanishings. Whether that reason is true or not, the custom continues without doubt. Stories about the so-called Mother Guardian reveal how deeply this belief is rooted. According to the tribes, the enormous spider described by hunters is always female. They say she commands a vast territory stretching through parts of the forest outsiders rarely enter. Smaller spiders act as scouts, watching trails and alerting the larger one when prey crosses her range. This is the first time any account from the region suggests the species may display coordinated behavior. The tribes do not see this as strange to them. It is simply how the forest functions. There is one story even the elders hesitate to share, because they believe it shows exactly what the J'Ba Fofi can do. They call it the Night of the White Bones. It tells of a hunting party that stepped into a clearing deep within restricted land and realized they had entered the feeding ground of the giant spider. Dozens of skeletons dangled from trees in half-woven cocoons wrapped in thick silk, identical to the strands the tribes link to the J'Ba Fofi. The bodies were not ancient. Some still held pieces of flesh, meaning the spider had fed recently and would probably return. The hunters fled without touching anything, and the entire village now regards that clearing as forbidden ground. No one has entered since. When asked why these accounts were not widely shared with researchers before, the elders offer a clear answer. Outsiders who searched for the spider often vanished. Speaking too freely about the creature was believed to attract attention, and attention meant risk. Guided by these warnings, Thomas Avery, a trained arachnologist, journeyed to the Congo to examine the unusual web formations, the web that should not exist. Thomas Avery already knew from the tribes that the J'Ba built enormous webs for hunting, but nothing prepared him for the size and intricate design of the structure he discovered deep within the forest. The web stretched nearly 3 meters between trees. Every strand appeared unnaturally thick, almost like fishing line. When Thomas raised his machete to test its tension, the blade bent slightly instead of slicing through. That was the moment he realized he was facing a material stronger than any known spider silk. Thomas gathered several strands and later confirmed using portable field tools that the silk contained rare protein chains able to bind with trace metals in the soil. This made the thread tougher and more flexible than anything documented in arachnology. The web also showed clear signs that the spider had fed recently. Thomas inspected the silk and discovered feathers that were partly dissolved. He found bird bones snapped into neat sections, suggesting a predator powerful enough to break bones quickly. A dried leg from a small antelope species known as a duiker still dangled from one edge. There was also a torn fragment of what appeared to be a human shirt snagged near the lower portion of the web. These findings pointed to a broad diet that included animals far larger than typical spider prey. It also raised serious concerns about recent disappearances in nearby areas. Another detail unsettled Thomas. The faint, sweet scent villagers described lingered around the web. He tested the odor with a handheld detector and identified chemical markers matching pheromones. This meant the smell was intentional. It was a deliberate signal the spider used to claim territory or communicate with others of its species. Thomas had installed motion-activated cameras earlier in the expedition. When he checked the footage after finding the web, he saw something that made him pause. One recording captured a massive appendage thicker than a human arm grazing the outer threads. It did not resemble a monkey limb or the leg of any known mammal. Another camera revealed steady tremors rippling through the web at slow, heavy intervals. These vibrations indicated a creature with immense body weight shifting nearby. While gathering samples, Thomas accidentally brushed a coated strand of silk with his wrist. Within seconds, his skin turned red and began to burn. He rinsed the area immediately. Later, chemical testing showed that the silk carried active digestive enzymes. These enzymes start breaking down tissue the instant prey is trapped. This meant the spider did not always rely on venom first. The silk itself could begin digestion while the prey remained alive. The evidence made it clear that this web was not merely a snare. It functioned as a chemical weapon and a living extension of the creature's hunting system. Every element was crafted to weaken, disorient, or dissolve prey. But the web was only the signal. What followed proved the J'Ba Fofi was not avoiding humans. It was observing them. The attack in the canopy. Thomas Avery pressed deeper into the rainforest with his guide Inoshi, determined to record more proof of the J'Ba Fofi. They advanced carefully and stayed sharp because the forest felt altered now. The air hung thick, the insects had fallen silent, and even the leaves seemed frozen. Thomas lifted his camera to film the arrangement of the trees, but before he could start recording, a sharp crack split the air above him. It sounded like a heavy branch snapping under pressure. Another crack followed, then violent shaking rippled through the canopy. Something enormous was moving across the upper layers of the forest. Thomas pointed his flashlight upward. The beam barely touched the lower branches, yet the disturbance continued higher above. Without warning, a huge shadow plunged through the leaves. The impact rattled nearby trees and scattered debris in a wide ring. Leaves poured down in heavy clusters. Thomas staggered backward as the figure settled onto a branch thick enough to hold a person. The creature remained motionless at first. When the leaves finally drifted down, he saw it clearly. The legs were unnaturally long, like sturdy wooden beams stretching outward in several directions. The body matched the size of a grown man's torso, swollen and solid. Its eyes caught the light with a faint golden glow. Thomas understood instantly that the spider was staring straight at him. There was no confusion and no pause. Its stance mirrored that of a predator assessing prey. The spider acted without warning. It lunged forward with shocking speed and expelled a strand of silk that shot through the air like a cable. The silk slammed into Thomas's shoulder hard enough to send him reeling sideways. The force stunned him because he had never imagined silk could be projected with such power. The strand seared through his shirt at once. He felt sharp heat against his skin as chemicals in the silk reacted with the fabric. Inoshi seized Thomas by the arm and dragged him back while yelling for him to run. They sprinted toward a cluster of trees seeking cover. Thomas glanced behind him, expecting pursuit, but the creature stayed where it was. Instead, It lowered itself slightly on the branch and kept its gaze locked on them. It showed no panic or surprise. Its actions felt deliberate, as though the strike had been meant to measure range, speed, or resilience. The spider stayed still for several long seconds. Then it eased backward into the canopy. It did not retreat in fear, and it did not vanish hastily. It simply climbed into the branches with steady control while holding eye contact as long as possible. Thomas realized the creature was analyzing them rather than hunting for food. Later, he noted in his journal that the spider moved with discipline. He admitted this unsettled him more than open aggression because it implied thought instead of pure instinct. A predator that experiments with its prey is far more lethal than one that attacks without thinking. This encounter destroyed any belief that the creature was merely an oversized animal. Thomas wanted explanations, and the biology of the monster exposed terrors evolution should never have permitted. Biology of a monster. Thomas Avery knew the J'Ba Fofi would be dangerous, but he believed the tribes understood it better than anyone. The further he examined its biology, the more obvious it became that even the elders had witnessed only a fraction of what this species could accomplish. The legends served as warnings shaped by fear, yet the scientific findings pointed to something far more disturbing. This was not merely a giant spider with abnormal strength. It was a predator molded by evolution in ways that broke natural boundaries. Thomas first focused on its feeding behavior. Tribal stories insisted the spider fed infrequently, and his research supported this claim. The J'Ba Fofi possessed an extremely slow metabolic rate, allowing it to survive on just 3 or 4 significant kills per year. This enabled the creature to stay perfectly still for extended periods, waiting for prey to cross into its territory. What the tribes never understood was what occurred after capture. The venom induced complete paralysis within minutes, yet it did not eliminate awareness. Victims often stayed conscious for hours as the spider fed. The J'Ba Fofi liquefied tissue externally and consumed it gradually, meaning prey endured the entire ordeal without the power to move or scream. Further study of the silk exposed another layer of terror absent from the legends. The venom contained chemicals that disrupted brain function. These substances triggered confusion, terror, and intense hallucinations. This clarified why many villagers described spirits or shadowy shapes drifting through the trees during attacks. They were not witnessing the supernatural. They were suffering neurological effects from the venom while immobilized in silk. Victims did not perish solely from the bite. Their senses deteriorated slowly, trapping them between consciousness and paralysis as the spider fed unhurriedly. The anatomy of the J'Ba Fofi also challenged everything known about arachnids. Exoskeleton pieces Thomas collected were strengthened with mineral layers. This reinforcement gave the shell bone-like durability and enabled the spider to endure blows from large animals. The tribes assumed the spider avoided fights, but Thomas realized it avoided them because it had developed superior hunting strategies, not because it lacked power. He also discovered tracks pressed into the soil near their camp. Each night, the impressions edged closer. The spider was not roaming aimlessly. It was following them. Its movements shifted according to the team's actions. It steered clear of cameras. It positioned itself downwind. It advanced silently when they rested and retreated when they traveled. This behavior demonstrated calculated observation. Every finding confirmed one chilling reality. The J'Ba Fofi was not simply a misunderstood legend. It was a species developing intelligence, planning, and awareness beyond expectation. Still unsettled, Thomas and Inosi ventured further into the forest. What awaited them next shattered the legend in the most terrifying way imaginable. The nest no human was meant to find. Thomas Avery believed he was following one creature. Every sign pointed to a single massive predator living alone across a wide territory. That assumption shattered when he and Enoshi traced disturbed soil to a stretch of forest where several towering trees had fallen in the same direction. At first glance, it resembled ordinary storm destruction. Then Thomas realized the earth beneath the trunks was hollow. The collapse had revealed a gap in the ground, and warm air surged upward from the darkness below. As he stepped closer, he felt the temperature climb. The heat was unnatural. It hinted at a regulated space sustained by something living underneath. They carefully lowered themselves through the opening and entered a chamber extending deep below the forest floor. When Thomas's light swept across the walls, he understood the legend had not prepared him for this sight. Dozens of massive silk pods lined the cavern. Each one measured roughly the size of a pumpkin. Thomas counted more than 40 before forcing himself to stop. Some were torn open. Others showed clear signs of hatching. Strands of silk climbed the walls and vanished into narrow cracks leading back to the surface. This meant the spiders were not merely reproducing. They had already begun emerging from the nest. Thomas shifted his flashlight again and detected motion at the chamber's far end. Several dark forms slid from the shadows and started circling. They were not fully grown, yet even at their reduced size, they were large enough to kill a person. Their bodies rose to the height of a man's waist. Their actions were synchronized. The spiders edged left and right together before gradually tightening their ring. This degree of cooperation proved that coordination was not limited to adults. It was built into the species from the beginning. As Thomas retreated, he nearly stepped on something that froze him. Half buried in the dirt lay a torn boot. Beside it rested a shattered camera lens. A few inches away were fractured human bones arranged in a curved pattern. The bones were pale and stripped clean, evidence that enzymes had dissolved every trace of flesh. There were far too many to belong to one victim. Thomas spotted multiple femurs and ribs. Someone had deliberately positioned them after feeding. It became obvious that humans had reached this nest long before Thomas and Enoshi, and none had survived. Once he grasped the layout of the forest above, the purpose of the giant webs finally became clear. A broad ring of trees surrounding the nest was wrapped in tripwire strands. These were not accidental snares. They were constructed to steer prey toward the underground chamber. When an animal struck the lines, vibrations pulsed through the soil and alerted the spiders below. The forest was not just a hunting zone. It was a funnel channeling living beings into the nest so the young could feed and mature. This realization destroyed everything Thomas believed about the legend. The tribes had warned of a single guardian because they assumed sightings referred to one beast. The truth was far more horrifying. The J'Ba Fofi was not an isolated remnant of an ancient species. It belonged to a breeding colony concealed beneath one of the world's most remote forests. Shaken and overwhelmed, Thomas knew exposing this discovery could ignite panic or trigger dangerous efforts to capture the species. He also understood they had to escape before the spiders completed their tightening circle. Yet leaving the forest would prove far more difficult than entering it.